Have you ever noticed how some people act completely unbothered until you actually disappear, not threaten to leave, not pull away for a few hours, not send long emotional paragraphs? I mean, truly detached, truly cut off access, no checking in, no emotional availability, no reassurance, nothing. And suddenly the same person who seemed cold, distant, almost indifferent, feels something shift inside them. That's what we're talking about today. Because avoidant psychology is misunderstood. People think they don't care. People think they move on instantly. People think silence means strength. But here's the truth. Most won't tell you. What hurts them isn't always losing you as a person at first. What hits them first is losing access to you. And that loss, it stings deeper than they expected. They didn't think you would actually close the door. They thought you would always be there. Even if they gave the bare minimum, even if they pulled away, even if they took days to respond, they assumed your presence was permanent. And when permanent suddenly becomes unavailable, their internal world doesn't stay calm. It shakes. It just doesn't shake loudly. So if you're sitting there wondering whether they feel the silence, whether being cut off affects them, whether the distance actually lands, stay with me, because the psychology behind this is deeper than pride, deeper than ego, deeper than what you see on the surface. See, avoidant attachment is built on one powerful illusion: control. Control over closeness, control over distance, control over when they show up and when they disappear. In relationships, they often regulate intimacy like a thermostat. If it gets too warm, too emotional, too real, they cool it down. If things feel distant enough to feel safe, they lean in just enough to maintain connection. But here's the part they rarely admit, even to themselves. They assume the other person will always remain accessible. They believe they can pull away and you'll wait. They believe they can disconnect and you'll understand. They believe that even if they don't prioritize you consistently, you won't fully remove yourself. That belief becomes their emotional safety net. It allows them to avoid vulnerability because deep down they think the relationship isn't truly at risk. That's why when you finally stop arguing, stop explaining, stop chasing, stop trying to fix, and you just quietly withdraw your energy, something shifts, the illusion breaks. The control they thought they had dissolves, and when that happens, it doesn't feel empowering to them. It feels destabilizing because now they're not managing closeness anymore. They're facing loss, and this is where people get confused between love and access. Love is emotional depth. Access is availability. For someone with avoidant tendencies, access can feel just as regulating as love. Knowing you're there, knowing they can text you if they want, knowing they can scroll your page, knowing they can come back after space and you'll respond. That knowledge becomes a quiet comfort in the background of their life. They may not express affection consistently. They may not communicate vulnerability openly, but the awareness that you are reachable becomes part of their emotional system. It's like a safety valve. They don't have to use it often. They just need to know it exists. So when you cut off access, truly cut it off, you're not just removing conversation. You're removing their visible safety net. You're taking away the background reassurance they never acknowledged needing, and when that disappears, their nervous system reacts. Not always outwardly, not always dramatically, but internally, there's a shift from confidence to uncertainty, from comfort to restlessness, from assumed permanence to sudden instability. At first, they might not show shock. In fact, many avoidants respond to being cut off with what looks like indifference, silence, maybe even relief. But relief is often the first layer of defense, because if they can convince themselves they don't care, they don't have to confront what's underneath. The real shock doesn't always happen the moment you stop responding. It happens when time passes, when days turn into weeks, when they check their phone and realize there's no message waiting, when they scroll and see no trace of you reaching out, when the pattern they relied on you coming back, you explaining, you fixing, doesn't repeat. That's when the reality sets in. You're not playing a game, you're not testing them, you're gone. And for someone who quietly depended on your emotional presence, that realization can feel heavier than they expected, because now they can't control the narrative. They can't pull you closer when they feel lonely. They can't distance themselves to feel safe. The door isn't half open anymore. It's closed. And this is where we have to go deeper, because the pain of losing access doesn't just touch their ego. It touches their core wound. Avoidant attachment often forms early in life when emotional needs weren't consistently met or vulnerability didn't feel safe. So they learn to self-soothe, to detach, to minimize needs, to rely on themselves. But here's the paradox. Even the most independent person still has attachment needs. They just bury them. They convince themselves they don't need closeness. They downplay longing. They reframe connection as optional. Yet, when someone who consistently showed up emotionally suddenly disappears, it unconsciously triggers that early wound. Not always in a clear thought like I'm afraid of abandonment. It's subtler than that. It feels like unease, irritability, restlessness, and you expected sadness that surfaces at night, a memory that lingers longer than it used to. Being cut off forces them into a position they didn't prepare for, the one being left, and many avoidants are more comfortable leaving than being left. When you leave, you control the to ending. When they leave, they protect themselves from vulnerability. But when you cut them off, they lose both control and protection at the same time. What makes this even more intense is that avoidants often suppress emotion in real time. During the relationship, they might have minimized your importance, focused on your flaws, highlighted incompatibilities, created distance in their mind to justify emotional space. But once access is gone, the C activation strategies weaken. Space has a strange effect. It removes the immediate triggers that made closeness feel overwhelming. And without those triggers, clarity can creep in. They start remembering the warmth instead of the conflict, the comfort instead of the pressure, the familiarity instead of the fear. That's when sadness begins to surface. Not always dramatically, not always with tears, but with subtle longing. And here's the part that might surprise you. Many avoidants don't know how to process that sadness, because admitting they miss you means admitting they were attached. And attachment is what they've trained themselves to downplay. So instead of expressing it, they internalize it. They sit with it quietly. Sometimes they distract themselves. Sometimes they dive into work. Sometimes they try to replace the connection quickly, hoping the feeling will disappear. But replacement doesn't restore access, and that's what hurts. The realization that you are no longer emotionally available to them in the way you once were. If you're the one who cut them off, you might feel invisible right now. You might feel like your absence doesn't matter. But psychologically speaking, removing access changes the dynamic more than any argument ever could. Because arguments still maintain connection. Silence removes it. And when silence stretches long enough to feel permanent, it forces reflection. It forces confrontation with feelings they avoided when you were present. And while not every avoidant responds the same way, the common thread is this. Losing guaranteed access disrupts their emotional equilibrium. It challenges their belief that distance protects them from pain, because now the pain isn't coming from too much closeness, it's coming from too much distance, and that shift can be deeply uncomfortable. So if you're sitting there wondering whether it hurts them to be cut off, understand this. What hurts isn't just the absence of communication, it's the loss of certainty, the loss of control, the loss of knowing you're still within reach. Avoidants don't always grieve loudly. They don't always chase. They don't always confess regret. But internal discomfort doesn't require external drama. Sometimes the deepest shifts happen in silence. And when someone who once had full access to your heart suddenly realizes that access has been permanently revoked, it forces them into emotional territory they've spent years trying to avoid. And that territory, it doesn't feel empowering, it feels exposing. And when someone who has built their entire emotional defense system around not being exposed suddenly finds themselves in that exact position, the reaction isn't always loud, but it is real. After the initial shock fades and the ego tries to stabilize the narrative, something quieter begins to happen beneath the surface. A silent spiral, not the dramatic kind where they break down publicly or send long emotional confessions. No, this is internal, subtle, private. They start thinking more than they want to. Your absence creates space, and space creates thought. Thought creates memory, and memory, when it's no longer clouded by fear of intimacy, can start to soften things they once criticized. The same person who once needed distance now finds themselves sitting in it, and distance feels very different when you didn't choose it. That's the twist. Avoidants are comfortable creating space. They are not comfortable being placed in it without control. So when you cut them off, the silence isn't just quiet. It becomes loud inside their mind. They may not reach out, they may not show it, but internally there's processing happening, there's replaying happening, there's a subtle ache that grows in moments when distractions fade. And here's where we separate something important. Ego bruise versus heartbreak. Because when someone loses access to the first sting can hit their ego. The realization that you had the strength to walk away. The awareness that you didn't beg, that you didn't chase, that you didn't crumble, that challenges their perception of control. But ego pain fades quicker than attachment pain. What lingers longer is the emotional disruption. You weren't just someone who sent messages. You were part of their routine, their comfort, their familiar energy. Even if they didn't say it often, your presence mattered. And when presence turns into absence, the nervous system notices. That's the part people overlook. Attachment isn't always loud. Affection, sometimes it's quiet dependence. Knowing someone is there to listen, knowing someone cares, knowing someone is emotionally invested. When that vanishes, the body reacts before pride can mask it. Restlessness, difficulty focusing, a strange emptiness during moments that used to be shared. They might ask themselves why they feel unsettled when they were the one who kept things distant. And that confusion can be frustrating for them because it exposes some. Either they tried to deny they were attached more than they admitted. You see, in many relationships with avoidant patterns, you unknowingly become part of their emotional regulation system. Not because they openly lean on you in vulnerable ways, but because your consistency stabilizes them, your messages, your check-ins, your warmth, even your attempts to fix conflict. It all becomes predictable, and predictability equals safety. So when you remove access, it's not just about missing conversation. It's about losing regulation. Suddenly they don't have that familiar reassurance. Suddenly the comfort they took for granted is gone. And without it, they feel slightly off balance. Maybe they try to ignore it. Maybe they distract themselves. Maybe they convince themselves it's freedom. But freedom doesn't usually come with a subtle ache. Freedom feels light. What they often feel instead is something heavier, a quiet pull backward. And because avoidants are wired to suppress discomfort rather than sit in it, this stage can feel especially disorienting. That's when the replaying begins. Late at night during drives, in moments of stillness, they start revisiting memories, not just the arguments or the pressure, but the small things, the laughter, the shared silence, the familiarity of your presence. Here's the psychological twist. During the relationship, their mind may have focused on what felt overwhelming. After you're gone, their mind has room to remember what felt safe. Space changes perception. When closeness isn't triggering their fear anymore, the positives become clearer, and sometimes, ironically, they appreciate you more in absence than they did in presence. Not because they didn't value you before, but because fear was louder than gratitude. Now, fear is replaced with uncertainty, and uncertainty can amplify longing. They may not call it longing. They may label I. Curiosity, nostalgia, boredom. But the frequency of your appearance in their thoughts increases. And that increase says something deeper than words ever could. There's also something called delayed grief, and this is critical to understand. Avoidants often experience relief immediately after separation. Relief from emotional intensity, relief from perceived pressure, relief from vulnerability. That relief can make it seem like they're unaffected. But relief is temporary. Once the nervous system calms, once the distractions settle, once the novelty of independence fades, the weight of what was lost can surface. And when it does, it surprises them because they didn't expect to feel it this strongly. They thought distance would confirm their detachment. Instead, distance sometimes reveals attachment. Weeks later, months later, at random moments, they might see something that reminds them of you, hear a song, visit a place, and the sadness hits unexpectedly, not dramatic, but undeniable. And here's the part that might be hard to hear. They may not know how to process that sadness, so they push it down. They rationalize it. They convince themselves you weren't compatible. But suppressed emotion doesn't disappear. It lingers quietly. Your silence plays a powerful role in this stage because arguments keep emotional energy alive. Even conflict is connection. But true silence removes stimulation. It forces introspection. When you stop reacting, stop responding, stop giving them access to your emotional world, it creates a vacuum, and vacuums pull attention. They can't gauge how you feel. They can't test if you'd reply. They can't test if you'd reply. They can't casual check in to soothe curiosity. The lack of access removes their safety valve completely. And for someone who values independence, yet subconsciously relied on optional connection, that loss feels destabilizing. It's not about control in a manipulative sense. It's about emotional predictability. They were used to you being there, even if they didn't show up fully, even if they pulled away, they believed access was still available. Once that belief collapses, so does the comfort attached to it. And as time continues, something else happens. They begin to notice your absence in ways they didn't expect, not just emotionally, but practically. The absence of your perspective, your energy, your familiarity. New interactions don't feel the same. New conversations lack history, and history carries weight. You shared moments, inside jokes, emotional layers built over time. That can't be replicated overnight. So even if they try to distract themselves with someone new, it doesn't immediately fill the space you occupied. Familiarity is powerful, and when familiarity is removed abruptly, the contrast becomes clear. That contrast can create a quiet sadness that they don't openly admit, because admitting it would require vulnerability. And vulnerability is what they've spent years avoiding. So if you're wondering whether being cut off hurts them, understand this. It challenges their emotional blueprint. It removes the illusion of permanent access. It disrupts their regulation. It forces reflection. It triggers delayed grief. And it exposes attachment they downplayed. That doesn't mean they will always act on it. It doesn't mean they will always reach out. But internal experience and external behavior are two different things. Just because you don't see panic doesn't mean there isn't discomfort. Just because you don't receive a message doesn't mean you aren't missed. Sometimes the deepest emotional reactions happen in silence, and when someone who quietly depended on your presence realizes that presence is no longer accessible, it doesn't feel empowering, it feels uncertain, and uncertainty is something avoidant psychology. When you detach, it struggles with the most because uncertainty removes their ability to predict outcomes, and prediction is how they keep themselves emotionally safe. When you were still accessible, even during conflict, they could tell themselves a story. If I need to, I can reach out. If I miss them, they'll probably respond. If I feel lonely, they're still there. That quiet optionality was their emotional cushion. But now that option is gone, and what hurts isn't just missing you. It's realizing they no longer have the power to decide when or if connection happens. Control is gone, and that's what cuts deeper than pride ever will. When someone who has always regulated intimacy by stepping back suddenly can't step forward on their own terms, it creates a kind of internal friction they don't know how to resolve. They might open their phone and stare at your contact only to remember they can't reach you the way they used to. They might check for updates and find silence instead. And that silence doesn't just block communication, it blocks reassurance, it blocks curiosity, it blocks comfort. They're no longer choosing distance. Distance is choosing them, and that shift flips the entire dynamic. Some people assume that if an avoidant jumps into something new quickly, it means they're unaffected. But here's the psychological truth. Replacement is often distraction, not resolution. A new person can offer novelty, attention, dopamine, but they can't replicate shared history overnight. They can't mirror the specific emotional rhythm you built together. And familiarity, especially for someone who fears vulnerability, is powerful. You were known, you understood patterns, you navigated their distance, you stayed longer than most would. That creates an imprint. So when they attempt to fill the void with someone else, it might temporarily mute the discomfort, but it doesn't erase the underlying realization that they lost something stable, something consistent, something that required less explanation. And over time, when novelty fades, comparison quietly begins, not always consciously, not always fairly, but it happens. The new connection lacks the depth you once shared, and that awareness can sting in ways they didn't anticipate. Inside them, there's often a tug-of-war between pride and pain. Pride says, don't reach out, don't look weak, don't admit you care. Pain says, this feels heavier than expected. Pride reminds them of every argument, every reason they justified pulling away. Pain reps the softer memories, the safe moments, the emotional warmth they minimized. And because avoidants are wired to prioritize self-protection, pride can win for a while. They may stay silent, not because they don't miss you, but because reaching out would require vulnerability. And vulnerability feels like losing even more control. Imagine wanting to reconnect, but fearing rejection. Fearing that you've truly moved on, fearing that the door you thought was half open is fully closed. That fear can paralyze action. So they sit in limbo, missing you quietly, wondering if you're thinking about them, hoping you might break silence first, but you don't. And every day you remain emotionally unavailable, reinforces the reality that this isn't temporary. Then comes another wave. The moment they sense you're genuinely moving forward, maybe they hear through mutual circles that you seem happier. Maybe they notice subtle changes in your energy if your paths cross. Maybe they simply feel the shift in your detachment. Whatever the trigger, it hits differently because now it's not just about losing access, it's about losing significance. The fear that you're no longer emotionally tethered to them, that your heart isn't waiting, that your focus has shifted inward or elsewhere, and for so Me, one who quietly assumed permanence, that realization can feel like a second breakup. The first was losing access. The second is losing relevance. And relevance matters more than they admit. Being someone's emotional anchor, even if they didn't fully show up, gave them a sense of quiet importance. When that importance fades, it exposes insecurity they worked hard to suppress. Being blocked or ignored intensifies this even further because now visibility is gone too. They can't observe your life from a distance. They can't check for signs that you still care. They can't monitor whether you're truly moving on. And that lack of information can feel suffocating for someone who avoids direct vulnerability but relies on indirect reassurance. When you remove visibility, you remove their ability to self-soothe through observation. They are forced to sit with the unknown, and the unknown amplifies everything. Doubt, regret, curiosity, longing. It's not just that they can't talk to you, it's that they can't see you. And for someone who is comfortable keeping emotional distance while still having visual proximity, that sudden cutoff can feel intense. It strips away their coping mechanism. There's also something deeply humbling about being left when you're used to leaving first. Avoidants often create emotional exits before the relationship fully ends. They detach gradually. They prepare themselves. They convince themselves they're less invested than they are. That preparation gives them a sense of control. But when you cut them off decisively, you remove their preparation window. You end it on your terms, and that reversal exposes dependency they didn't plan for. They may have believed they needed less than you did. They may have believed they were the emotionally stronger one, but your ability to walk away challenges that narrative. It forces them to they were more attached than they allowed themselves to admit. And that realization can feel destabilizing to their identity. Now, let's be honest. Not every avoidant reaches deep self-awareness in this stage. Some double down. Some convince themselves you were incompatible. Some bury emotion under distraction. But many, especially when time stretches long enough, experience a quiet reckoning. They start recognizing patterns. They start noticing how often they think about you. They start feeling the weight of missed opportunities. Regret doesn't always look like dramatic apologies. Sometimes it looks like reflection. Sometimes it looks like late-night realizations they never voice. And sometimes it looks like subtle attempts to re-enter your orbit when enough time has passed. But whether they act on it or not, the internal shift matters because losing access forced them into emotional territory. They've avoided their whole lives confronting what they feel without the safety of distance. And here's where the focus gently shifts back to you, because while we analyze what happens inside them, the most powerful transformation is happening inside you. Cutting off access isn't about punishment. It's about self-preservation. It's about recognizing that love without reciprocity drains you. It's about understanding that constant emotional pursuit creates imbalance. When you remove yourself, you're not just teaching them a lesson. You're reclaiming your energy. You're stepping out of a dynamic where you carried more weight than you should have, and that shift changes the power structure permanently. Even if they return, even if they express regret, the dynamic will never be the same because you've proven to yourself that you can survive without them, that you can choose dignity over desperation, and that confidence radiates differently. There's something deeply transformative. About realizing your value isn't tied to someone else's emotional capacity. Avoidants don't lack feelings. They struggle with sustaining vulnerability. And when you finally stop trying to extract depth from someone who isn't ready to offer it, you create space for healthier connection, whether with them in a more balanced way or with someone entirely new. But either way, the act of cutting off access re-enters you. It reminds you that your presence is a privilege, not a guarantee. And when someone loses that privilege, especially someone who assumed it was permanent, it forces growth in them or in you. So if you've been questioning whether they feel it, whether it hurts, whether being cut off matters, understand this. Losing access disrupts avoidance psychology at its core. It removes control. It challenges pride. It exposes attachment. It triggers delayed grief. It creates reflection. And sometimes it sparks regret. But more importantly, it restores your power. And in the end, the greatest shift isn't whether they're sad. It's that you finally chose yourself. But let's close this in a way that's honest, grounded, the real. Because the final layer of this conversation isn't about revenge, ego, or proving a point. It's about understanding what was actually happening beneath the surface the entire time. When we say avoidance or sad, they lost access to you, we're not saying they're sitting somewhere dramatically falling apart every day. We're saying something much more nuanced. We're saying that when access disappears, it confronts them with the truth they spent the relationship avoiding. They were more emotionally involved than they allowed themselves to believe. Here's the revelation most people miss. It was never about them not caring. It was about them not having the capacity to care in a consistent, secure, emotionally available way. That's a huge difference, because when someone lacks capacity, they protect themselves from feelings that feel overwhelming. They downplay importance. They minimize attachment. They convince themselves they're fine with distance. But the moment distance becomes permanent and not self-chosen, that defense collapses. And when defense collapses, raw feeling seeps through, not always loudly, not always bravely, but quietly in moments when they least expect it. They might be driving alone and suddenly think about your laugh. They might scroll through old photos and feel a wave of something they can't quite name. They might meet new people and feel an unspoken comparison forming in their chest. And in those moments, it hits them not in words, not in a dramatic confession, but in sensation. That was safe. That was real. That mattered. The sadness doesn't come from losing control alone. It comes from recognizing that what they had was emotionally stabilizing and they didn't nurture it properly. That's a hard pill to swallow for someone who built their identity around self-sufficiency. And this is where regret becomes complex. Do they regret losing you sometimes? Do they regret how they handled it? Often, yes, but privately. Regret for an avoidant doesn't always turn into immediate action, because action would require humility. It would require risking rejection. And that risk feels enormous to someone who already fears emotional exposure. So instead, regret can turn into reflection. Reflection can turn into growth. Or if they resist it, reflection can turn into suppression. Again, that fork in the road depends entirely on their level of self-awareness. But let's talk about something deeper, something that matters more than whether they text you. Again, when you cut off access, you force the psychological mirror in front of them. You remove the distraction of conflict. You remove the comfort of optional connection. You remove the illusion that they could drift in and out of intimacy without consequence. And consequence is what creates transformation. Even if they don't transform immediately, the seed is planted. The awareness that someone valuable walked away because emotional inconsistency wasn't sustainable, that awareness lingers. Now, here's the part that's important for you to hear. Them being sad doesn't mean you should reopen the door. Them missing access doesn't mean you owe them another chance. Their internal discomfort does not override your emotional well-being. Because remember, you didn't cut access out of cruelty. You did it because staying accessible was costing you peace. And peace is expensive. You paid for it with silence, with restraint, with resisting the urge to reach out, with sitting in your own discomfort, instead of running back to familiarity. That strength, quiet strength, the kind that changes you permanently. There's also a powerful psychological truth about scarcity. Humans value what feels scarce. When something feels guaranteed, it becomes background noise. When something becomes limited or unavailable, its importance sharpens. Your absence sharpens your value. Not because you played a game, not because you manipulated the dynamic, but because you stepped out of it. You stopped over-functioning. You stopped compensating for emotional gaps. You stopped proving your worth through patience. And when that consistent emotional labor vanished, the contrast became clear. You were doing more than they realized, and losing that feels destabilizing. But let's be balanced and mature about this. Avoidants are not villains. They are people shaped by early emotional experiences that taught them closeness equals risk. Their distancing wasn't always malicious. Often it was protective. They learned to equate vulnerability with loss of control. So when things got too emotionally intense, they pulled back to regulate. Unfortunately, that regulation came at your expense, and eventually you reached a threshold. You realized that loving someone shouldn't feel like constantly chasing emotional availability. That's when you made the hardest move, not yelling, not begging, not threatening, but quietly withdrawing. And that quiet withdrawal is what hurt the most, because it wasn't reactive, it was resolved. There's something deeply unsettling about someone who once fought for you suddenly choosing peace instead. Anger can be engaged with, tears can be responded to, but calm detachment that signals finality, that signals growth, that signals you're no longer operating from fear of losing them. And when they sense that shift, when they truly understand that you are not waiting in the wings anymore, It forces them to confront their own avoidance patterns without the buffer of your emotional availability. Some of them will grow from this slowly, uncomfortably. They may start questioning why intimacy feels threatening. They may begin recognizing the pattern of distancing when things get real. They may even seek tools to become more secure. And if that happens, it won't be because you convinced them. It will be because losing access made the cost of avoidance tangible. Sometimes pain is the only teacher strong enough to break long-standing defenses. Others may not grow immediately. They may distract, they may repeat patterns, they may tell themselves a story that protects their ego. But even then, somewhere in their subconscious, the experience of losing you sits as evidence. Evidence that emotional safety can disappear. Evidence that not everyone tolerates inconsistency forever. Evidence that independence without connection can feel hollow, and that evidence doesn't vanish easily. So when you look back, oh, this dynamic, don't measure your worth by whether they return. Measure it by who you became when you stopped chasing. Measure it by the emotional resilience you built when you chose silence over chaos. Measure it by the standards you reinforced within yourself. Because the real victory isn't them being sad, it's you no longer tolerating breadcrumbs. Avoidance psychology is complex. It's layered. It's filled with contradictions. They crave closeness, but fear dependency. They value connection, but protect autonomy. They miss you, but hesitate to reach out. They feel sadness, but mask it with composure. And losing access intensifies all of those contradictions at once. That's why it hurts them. Not because they're incapable of feeling, but because feeling without control is terrifying for them. But here's the final truth I want you to carry with you. Someone being sad they lost access to you does not automatically mean they were capable of loving you the way you deserved. Sadness can coexist with emotional limitation. Missing you can coexist with avoidance, and longing can coexist with fear. Your job was never to heal their attachment style. Your job was to protect your own heart. And you did. You stepped back, you closed the door, you removed access, and in doing so, you shifted the entire psychological dynamic. Whether they admit it or not, whether they act on it or not, whether they grow from it or not, losing you, it disrupted them. It challenged their comfort. It exposed their attachment. It forced reflection. And yes, in their own quiet internal way, it hurt. But the most important part of this story isn't their sadness. It's your strength.